How does it feel, Malcolm?
Garrett, stop.
No, let him answer. Come on, man. Does it hurt watching your wife become somebody while you stay decorative? Where did you get that pin?
It's just company history.
No, it's evidence.
The ballroom went quiet enough to hear Simone breathe. Richard stood too fast, and that was the first time all night anyone looked afraid of me.
6 hours earlier, I was still trying to decide whether I should even attend my wife's promotion dinner. I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom, straightening a navy tie I'd worn to exactly 4 events in the last 2 years. Simone was behind me, fastening pearl earrings, her black hair pulled back into the neat bun she wore whenever she needed to feel like the most competent person in a room. "Just be patient tonight," she said, not looking at me, watching herself in the mirror instead. "These people can be sharp." "Sharp doesn't bother me," I said. "Careless does." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "And maybe," she added, smoothing the front of her pastel pink dress, "don't get into the consulting stuff. Nobody there is going to understand it, and it just makes things complicated." I heard what she didn't say underneath what she did say. She had started to be embarrassed by the fog around what I did for a living. 11 years of marriage, and my wife still described my work to her friends as, "He does something with numbers." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the truth. "I won't bring it up," I told her, and I meant it, though not for the reason she thought. I wasn't protecting her comfort. I was protecting a promise I'd made to myself a long time ago, that Simone would build her career on what she earned, not on what she'd married into. I had never told her the size of what she'd actually married into. That was my mistake. I know that now. But that night, in front of the mirror, I still believed silence was a kind of loyalty. Before we left the house, Simone's mother, Lorraine, called to wish her luck. I heard most of it through the speaker while I searched the hall closet for my good shoes. Lorraine's voice had that particular warmth she reserved only for Simone's career. A warmth I'd noticed over the years she rarely extended to anything involving me. "You worked for this, baby," Lorraine said. "Don't let anybody at that dinner make you feel small for it. And tell Malcolm to wear something decent, would you?" Simone laughed, glancing at me across the room. "He's wearing navy. He always wears navy." "Well, tell him a suit doesn't make a career," Lorraine said. And I understood, even through the phone, that she wasn't talking about fabric. I didn't say anything. I'd made peace with Lorraine's opinion of me a long time ago. A mechanic's son who did something with numbers was never going to impress a woman who'd spent 30 years telling her daughter to marry visible success. I told myself it didn't matter what Lorraine believed about the shape of my ambition, as long as Simone knew better. That night, I was starting to understand she didn't. We drove to the hotel in near silence, the kind that isn't hostile, just full. Dallas at dusk moved past the windows, glass towers catching the last orange light. Oil money and logistics money and old money all stacked on top of each other downtown. Belmont Meridian Systems had booked the entire rooftop ballroom of the Ashcroft Hotel to celebrate 2 things: Simone's promotion to Regional Partnership Director and a new hospital supply partnership worth $180 million. I had read every page of that contract 11 days before Simone ever saw a summary of it. She didn't know that either. We walked in together. Simone's hand found the small of my back, a habit more than an affection, guiding me the way you'd guide someone into a room where you weren't sure they belonged. I led her. Garrett Voss found us before we'd made it to our table. "There's the man of mystery," he said, all teeth, an arm sliding around Simone's shoulder half a second too familiar.
"Still consulting with no clients we've ever seen?" Simone laughed, the practiced laugh she used for men like Garrett. Polite, quick, designed to end a conversation without starting a conflict. I'd heard that laugh at 3 other company events. It always made something in my chest go quiet and cold. Across the room, near the bar, I caught CEO Richard Bell looking at me. Not at Simone, at me. A second too long, the way a man looks at something he half recognizes from a dream he can't place. Then he turned away and laughed at something his CFO said, too loudly, the laugh of a man covering a flinch. I filed that away. I'd learned, over 18 months of quiet observation, that Richard Bell only laughed too loudly when something frightened him. Dinner started well enough. Course after course, a jazz trio in the corner, the kind of soft corporate applause that means nothing and everything at once. Garrett stood to give the toast, glass raised, and for the first 90 seconds it was almost gracious. "To Simone Reed," he said, "the sharpest partnership mind this company has found in a decade. Half the reason we landed the hospital deal is because she out-negotiated 3 grown men who thought they had the upper hand." Applause. Simone's cheeks flushed with something real. Pride, deserved pride, the kind I actually loved watching on her. Then Garrett's smile shifted, the way a blade catches light differently when it turns. "And," he said, looking around the table for his audience, "behind every successful woman is a man smart enough to stay out of the way." The room laughed. Simone didn't laugh loudly, but she laughed enough that I felt it, a small current running under the table straight into my ribs. I didn't say anything. I picked up my water glass instead of my wine, because I wanted a clear head for whatever came next. Some part of me already knew something was coming next. "How does it feel, Malcolm?"
Garrett raised his wine glass toward me like he was blessing a beggar. "How does it feel wearing a Navy suit to a room full of people who know your wife pays for it?" A few executives laughed. Simone touched my wrist. "Garrett, stop." "No, let him answer." He leaned closer, close enough that I could smell the wine on his breath. "Come on, man. Does it hurt watching your wife become somebody while you stay decorative?" I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because this isn't a story about a man who felt nothing. It hurt. Not because Garrett Voss's opinion mattered to me. It didn't, not really. But because Simone's hand on my wrist wasn't pulling me toward her. It was asking me to be smaller so the moment could pass faster. That was the part that hurt. I looked past Garrett's shoulder, past his smug, wine-flushed face, at the silver pin fastened to his lapel. Small. Understated. The kind of thing you'd miss unless you already knew what you were looking for. 3 letters engraved into it. N-17. I'd seen that pin exactly once before. in a photograph, in a file I wasn't supposed to have access to, on the lapel of a man who'd been dead for 6 years. Across the table, I heard a fork clatter against porcelain. Richard Bell's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "Where did you get that pin?" he whispered. Garrett blinked, thrown by the sudden shift in the room's temperature. "It's just company history," he said, though his smile had already started to crack at the corner, like a man realizing he's holding something he doesn't understand the weight of. I set my napkin down on the table, folding it once, the way my father used to when he'd decided a conversation was over. "No," I said. "It's evidence." Nobody laughed after that. The ballroom went quiet enough that I could hear Simone breathing beside me, fast and shallow. Richard Bell stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped. And in 11 years of marriage, in 44 years of being underestimated by rooms exactly like this one, that was the first time all night anyone had looked afraid of me. Richard recovered his composure quickly, the way men who've spent 30 years running a company learn to recover, smiling too wide, waving off his own outburst as low blood sugar and long week. The jazz trio picked back up. Someone refilled wine glasses. The machinery of a company dinner is built to swallow moments like that one and keep moving. Before I sat back down, I asked Garrett the question directly, quiet enough that only our end of the table heard it. "Where did you get that pin, Garrett?" He touched it, almost protectively, the way a man touches something he's proud of without understanding why it should be protected. "Found it in some old archive box during the office move last year," he said. "Thought it looked sharp." "Why, you want one?" "It wasn't meant to be found," I said. "It was meant to be kept. It's a company souvenir, Malcolm, not a state secret." He laughed, but it came out thinner than his last laugh had. "Relax." Richard leaned across the table, voice low and urgent. "Garrett, take it off. Now." "Richard, it's a pin." "Take it off," Richard said again, and this time 3 other executives at the table heard the strain in it and went quiet, sensing, the way animals sense weather, that something had shifted in the room that had nothing to do with wine or toasts. Garrett unclipped it, more confused than chastened, and slid it into his jacket pocket. "Somebody want to tell me what's actually going on?" Nobody answered him. I hadn't revealed anything yet, not who I was, not what the pin meant, not why a piece of stamped silver metal had turned a company founder's face the color of the tablecloth. I simply said, evenly, "Interesting, because that pin was never supposed to leave a sealed file." Richard wouldn't meet my eyes. "Malcolm," he said quietly, "not here." But Garrett wasn't finished. Men like Garrett rarely know when to stop. That instinct is usually what got them promoted in the first place. He reached for the standing microphone near the head table, the one meant for toasts, not confrontations, and tapped it twice. "Since Malcolm's suddenly become our company historian," he said, grinning out at the room, "maybe he can tell everyone what he actually does for a living. Because I've been trying to figure that out for 6 years. A ripple of laughter, smaller this time, uncertain. I looked at Simone. "I want to be honest about this too." I looked at her the way you look at someone when you're giving them one more chance to close a gap you felt widening for years. One sentence. That's all it would have taken. Something like,
My husband's business is his business, and it's not up for a toast.
She didn't say it. She looked down at her plate, jaw tight, and said nothing at all. I felt that silence more than I felt Garrett's words. Garrett was a stranger performing cruelty for an audience. Simone was my wife, choosing not to spend a single ounce of her new capital in that room to defend me. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and said only, "I think Mr. Bell would prefer we save company history for a boardroom." Richard's eyes found mine again, something close to gratitude in them, and close to dread. Simone pulled me toward the hallway before Garrett could say anything else. The hallway outside the ballroom had that hotel quiet, thick carpet, low gold lighting, the muffled thrum of the party behind a closed door. Simone rounded on me the second the door shut, her voice a controlled whisper instead of a shout, which somehow made it worse. "Why can't you let me have one room," she said, "where I don't have to explain you?" I let that land before I answered. 11 years, and that sentence told me more about how she saw me than anything Garrett had said all night. "Is that what I am now?" I asked. "Something you explain?" Her jaw tightened. "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant." I kept my voice level, because raising it would have handed her a version of this fight she could win. The volatile husband, the embarrassment confirmed. "You didn't say one word in there, Simone. Not one." "I was trying to keep the peace." "You were trying to survive the room," I said. "There's a difference." She looked away, toward the gold-flecked wallpaper, arms crossed over her pastel pink dress like she was cold, though the hallway wasn't cold at all. I took out my phone. I hadn't planned to show her this, not that night, not like this. But something in me had cracked open, the same way Garrett's smile had cracked, and I needed her to see one piece of what she'd never asked to see. I pulled up an old photograph. Grainy, 12 years old, scanned from a physical print. Richard Bell, younger, standing in a warehouse loading bay surrounded by a cluster of employees, drivers, warehouse staff, a couple of office workers. Every one of them wore the same small silver pin on their collar or lapel, N-17. Simone frowned at the screen. "What is this?" "Ask Richard why he looked afraid of a lapel pin tonight," I said. I didn't say anything else. Not yet. I wasn't ready, and if I'm honest, some old, stubborn part of me still wanted her to ask the next question herself, the way she should have asked it 3 years earlier, when she'd first seen a number she didn't recognize on a bank statement, and let the question die in her throat. She didn't ask, not that night. She handed the phone back to me, smoothed her dress, and said, "We need to go back in. People are watching." We went back in. Garrett had already moved on to charming a hospital administrator 2 seats down, laughing loud enough to fill the space where the confrontation had been. Richard Bell would not look at me again for the rest of the dinner. 3 days later, Althea Grant walked into Belmont Meridian Systems' downtown office carrying a leather folder the color of a deep ocean, and the temperature of every room she entered dropped by 10 degrees. I should explain who Althea is, because she matters more than her quiet presence would suggest. Althea had been my attorney for 11 years, since before Belmont Meridian Systems nearly collapsed, since before Simone and I had our first apartment. She spoke rarely, and when she did, she always had paper to back it up. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't need to be.
I wasn't there for the meeting, not at first. Simone told me about it that evening, still in her work blazer, sitting at our kitchen island with a glass of wine she hadn't touched.
There was a woman at the office today, she said. A lawyer. Richard looked like he'd seen a ghost. What did she want? She asked Garrett where he got his pin. Simone's eyes narrowed at me, some instinct clicking into place that she wasn't ready to name yet. She asked what archive he'd been in, who authorized it, what files he'd seen. She set the wine glass down. Malcolm, who is she? My attorney, I said. Simone went very still. Your attorney? Yes. You have an attorney? I've had one for 11 years. She stared at me the way you stare at a familiar photograph and suddenly notice a detail you'd never seen before, a shadow, a second figure at the edge of the frame. What is North Star? She asked. I heard that name today too, North Star Rescue Trust. I felt the floor of our marriage shift under that question, the way you feel a house settle in winter. A small, structural sound that tells you something has moved. The thing I should have told you about, I said, before strangers taught you how to see me. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, not yet. She just sat there, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem, and said, Then tell me now. So I did. Not all of it, that would take weeks. Not one kitchen conversation, but enough. 12 years earlier, Belmont Meridian Systems had been 6 weeks from bankruptcy. I wasn't married to Simone yet. I ran a small analytics firm out of a rented office above a tire shop, specializing in hospital logistics, routing, warehouse automation, the unglamorous math that keeps medical supplies moving from a distribution center to a rural clinic 3 hours away. Belmont had hired my firm for a routing audit, a small contract, nothing that should have changed my life. But the numbers told a different story than the company's public one. Belmont had lost a major military contract after a recall scandal. Investors were pulling out. Richard Bell, 39 years old at the time, founder's son energy and a founder's son debt problem, was 6 weeks from watching his father's company liquidate. 700 employees, warehouse staff, drivers, dispatch coordinators, technicians, people who had nothing to do with the recall and everything to lose because of it. I saw what Richard didn't, that underneath the mismanagement, the company's actual infrastructure was sound. The routing systems were good, the relationships with rural clinics and small hospitals were real and valuable. It was a company worth saving, run by people who didn't know how to save it. So I bought the distressed debt, quietly, through channels most people never see, converting it into controlling preferred shares. I placed the whole position into something I called the North Star Rescue Trust. Not for the poetry of the name, but because my mother used to say the North Star was the only direction you could trust in the dark. I let Richard keep his father's company and his own title, on one condition, written into the trust agreement in language even his own lawyers agreed to, without fully understanding what they'd signed. The company would protect its workers, and it would not defraud the people it served. If leadership ever knowingly allowed fraud, negligence, or a breach of fiduciary duty to threaten the company or its employees, the trust protector, me, could freeze voting rights. And if a CEO knowingly ignored procurement fraud, control transferred fully to the trust's beneficiary. 17 employees, the ones whose jobs were most immediately on the line that year, were given a small silver pin as a private symbol.
Something only they and Richard and I understood. N-17. Not a trophy. A promise. I never told Simone, because I met her 2 years after all of this, and because I was terrified, genuinely, quietly terrified, that if she knew what I controlled, she would never trust that she'd built her own career, and I would never trust that she loved the man instead of the leverage. "So all this time," Simone said slowly when I finished, "you've owned the company I work for." "I don't run it," I said. "I've never sat in on a single operations meeting. I've never touched a hiring decision. I made sure of that." "But you could." "If they broke their word to the people who needed protecting," I said. "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "The medical bills. My mother's medical bills 3 years ago. You said insurance corrected an error." "There was no error," I admitted. "I paid it." "The certification program." "The mortgage refinance that saved us $600 a month out of nowhere. Also me." She put her face in her hands, not crying, just breathing. The way you breathe when you're recalculating 11 years of your own life in real time. "You made me feel foolish tonight," she finally said, "for not knowing things you never let me know." "No," I said, "and this is the part I want to be honest about, because I wasn't blameless in this story, and I never want to tell it like I was. I made myself invisible, and then I got angry when you couldn't see me." The audit took 48 hours. Althea ran it the way she ran everything, without spectacle, methodically, page by page. What she found wasn't complicated once you saw it laid out. Garrett Voss had spent the better part of 3 years steering Belmont's largest vendor contracts toward a shell logistics company registered under his brother-in-law's name, over charges totaling $2.4 million, buried in line items no board member had bothered to read closely because Garrett was, in Richard's own words, the rainmaker. Medical supply shipments to 2 rural clinic networks had been delayed repeatedly, not because of any real supply chain issue, but because Garrett prioritized higher margin routes for the shell vendors' trucks. And buried in a compliance inbox nobody monitored properly were 19 months of anonymous reports, filed by a warehouse compliance manager named Vanessa Cole, flagging every single one of these issues in detail. Every report had been logged, acknowledged, and ignored. Richard Bell had seen 2 of those warnings personally. He'd forwarded neither to legal. He told himself, I imagine, that Garrett brought in too much revenue to lose over administrative noise. I met Vanessa Cole for the first time during that audit. 37 years old, precise, exhausted in the particular way of someone who has told the truth for 2 years and watched it disappear into a system built not to hear her. She didn't know who I was when Althea introduced me, simply as a trust representative. I stopped expecting anyone to read them, she told me of her reports. I just didn't want it on my conscience that I never said anything. I told her, someone read every one of them. It just took longer than it should have. She didn't smile. She'd earned the right not to. "Can I ask you something?" she said, once Althea had stepped out to make a call. "Why does a trust representative care about delayed shipments to a clinic in Ellis County?" I considered how much to tell her. In the end, I told her the truth, or at least a version close enough to it. Because my father spent 30 years as a subcontractor for a company like this one, I said. Underpaid, overworked, and invisible to the people who signed his checks. When I got the chance to make sure a company like that couldn't do that kind of damage to people like him again, I took it. Everything after that was just math. Vanessa studied me for a moment, the exhaustion in her face giving way, briefly, to something sharper. Most people who talk about protecting workers have never met one who wasn't grateful just to have a job. I grew up in a house where gratitude and exploitation looked identical from the outside, I said. I try not to make that mistake. She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away the same careful way she filed her reports. Evidence first, trust second, and only after the evidence held up. 19 months, she said. That's how long I sent those reports into what I was sure was a void. I want you to understand what that does to a person. You start doubting your own eyes. You start wondering if you're the problem for noticing. You weren't the problem, I said. The silence around you was. That was the moment, more than any boardroom vote that came after it, when I decided Vanessa Cole belonged in a room with real authority, not just real information. The boardroom, 48 hours after the dinner, held none of the ballroom's warmth. Fluorescent light instead of chandeliers, a long table instead of round ones. 9 board members, Richard Bell at the head, Garrett Voss 2 seats down, looking like a man who still believed, on some level, that charm could talk his way out of an audit. Althea laid the findings out page by page. 2.4 million in overcharges. Delayed shipments to clinics that served, among others, veterans and low-income families in 3 counties. 19 months of buried compliance reports. Garrett tried, at first, to make it about the dinner. "This is retaliation," he said, jabbing a finger toward me across the table. He's embarrassed I called him out in front of his wife's colleagues, and now he's coming after my job with some manufactured audit. I let him finish. Then I said, calmly, "If I wanted revenge, Garrett, I would have answered you in that ballroom. This is correction, not revenge. There's a difference, and I think somewhere in you already know it." He looked, for the first time since I'd known of him, genuinely afraid. Richard tried a different approach, the wounded patriarch, invoking 38 years of family legacy, asking to keep his title to protect market confidence, while promising immediate reforms. Althea opened the trust document and read the relevant clause aloud, flat and unhurried. Knowing failure to act on credible reports of procurement fraud constituted a breach sufficient to transfer full control to the trust's beneficiary. Richard's hands were shaking by the time she finished. "You knew," I said to him. "Not everything, but enough. 2 warnings crossed your desk, Richard, and you let them die there because Garrett's number looked good on a quarterly report." He didn't argue. That, more than anything, told me he understood exactly what he'd allowed. "I built this company back up after my father nearly ran it into the ground," Richard said, quieter now, some of the performance draining out of his voice. "I thought if I kept the numbers moving, kept the big clients happy, the rest would sort itself out underneath me. I didn't think 2 ignored reports would be the thing that ended it." "It's never the report that ends it, Richard," I said. "It's what a person decides a report is worth compared to a number on a spreadsheet." You decided Garrett's number was worth more than Vanessa's warning. Twice. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, I saw something in him that looked less like fear and more like genuine shame. I didn't take pleasure in it. I'd spent too many nights over the past 18 months studying this company's ledgers to feel triumphant watching a tired, 63-year-old man understand, in real time, exactly how he'd failed people who trusted him. One of the older board members, a woman named Patrice Okafor, who'd sat on Belmont's board since before I was involved, cleared her throat. "And you," she said, looking at me directly for the first time all meeting. "How long have you known all of this?" 18 months, in detail, I said. 12 years, in principle. "And you never once thought to inform this board?" "I informed the person the trust required me to inform," I said. "Richard. Twice, in writing, well before tonight. Ask him what those letters said." Richard didn't dispute it. That silence answered Patrice's question more completely than I could have. Garrett was terminated that afternoon, escorted out by building security. I refused to allow it to be filmed, refused the small, ugly satisfaction of turning his walk of shame into a spectacle the way he'd turned my marriage into one 3 nights earlier. Dignity isn't a reward you hand out selectively. If it means anything, it means something even for the man who tried to strip it from you. Richard Bell was removed as chief executive officer that same week, under terms Althea negotiated quietly, a face-saving retirement rather than a public purge, because I had learned by then that public humiliation rarely produces anything but more of itself. The board, predictably, balked when I nominated Vanessa Cole as interim chief compliance officer. "She's a warehouse manager," one board member said. "Not exactly executive polish." "How many warnings did she send?" I asked the table, "before one of you decided her title was too small to believe?" Nobody answered that. Nobody needed to. The vote passed. I did not take the CEO title myself. 3 board members assumed I would, quietly measuring me for the chair Richard had vacated. I told them the truth instead. "The company's had enough men protecting their chairs," I said. "It doesn't need one more." That night, in the car, the silence between Simone and me was a different kind than the one on the way to the dinner 3 days earlier. That silence had been full of things unsaid. This one was full of things newly said, still settling. "Do you own the company?" she finally asked, watching the Dallas skyline slide past the window. "I own the consequence," I said, "of what happens when people forget who the company was supposed to protect." "That's not an answer." "Yes," I admitted. "Enough of it to change what happens next." She was quiet for a long moment, and then quieter still. "You let me stand in that hallway and defend a version of you that wasn't even close to true." "I let a lot of things happen that I shouldn't have," I said. "That one included. We didn't fix it that night. I want to be honest about that too, because the easy version of this story ends with a single conversation solving 11 years of silence. And that isn't how marriages actually heal. What happened that night was smaller and more necessary. She asked, and for the first time in a long time, I actually answered. A week later, in the parking garage beneath her office building, Simone told me something that had been sitting in her for longer than the dinner had. We were standing beside the car, keys still in her hand, neither of us quite ready to get in and drive home. "There's something else," she said, "about Garrett." I felt my whole body go still in the particular way it does when you already sense the shape of what's coming before the words arrive. "Nothing happened," she said quickly. "Not physically. I need you to know that." She looked down at her keys. "But there were nights I let him talk about you, about how you didn't seem to want more, how I deserved someone who matched my ambition instead of someone who seemed content to just watch. And I didn't stop him. I let him say it because some tired part of me agreed with him, because I didn't understand what you were carrying, and it was easier to let a confident man tell me I deserved better than to ask my own husband a hard question. "Did you defend me?" I asked, "when I wasn't there?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched out long enough that it became its own answer. "No," she finally said, "I didn't." I stood with that for a moment, the concrete pillars and fluorescent hum of the garage feeling suddenly very loud around us. "There's more," she said. "A separate account. Not much. Not an affair, not anything like that. I just wanted something that was only mine, in case things ever fell apart and I needed to stand on my own. I told myself it was smart. Some nights, I think it was just fear." "I understand fear like that," I said, and I meant it. I built an entire trust because I didn't know how to ask for security at home. You opened an account for the same reason. We just built our walls out of different materials. She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Not forgiveness yet, not fully, but the first honest look she'd given me in longer than either of us wanted to admit. That evening, back at the house, she came downstairs still wearing the pastel pink dress from the night of the dinner. I hadn't realized she'd kept it hanging in the closet instead of sending it to the cleaners. It looked different now. Wrinkled at the hem, the fabric soft instead of sharp, the polish gone out of it the way the polish had gone out of the version of herself she'd worn to that ballroom. She unclasped her pearl earrings, one at a time, and set them on the counter. "I dressed like I belonged in that room," she said. "Then I let them make you feel like you didn't." I didn't have a clever answer for that. I just crossed the kitchen and held her, and for the first time since the dinner, she let herself be held without performing composure for anyone, including me. 3 months later, Belmont Meridian Systems held a different kind of event. Not a rooftop ballroom banquet with a string quartet and hospital executives in tailored suits. A warehouse floor, swept clean, long folding tables set end to end, drivers and dispatch coordinators and technicians and office staff sitting shoulder to shoulder. The smell of barbecue instead of seared scallops. Vanessa Cole was announced, officially, as permanent Chief Compliance Officer. Medical supply routes to the 2 neglected clinic networks had been restored and prioritized. A new whistleblower protection policy, drafted with Althea's help, guaranteed that no report would sit unread in an inbox for 19 months again. They asked me to say a few words. I wore a navy suit, the same color I'd worn to the dinner where all of this had started, though this time it didn't feel like armor. It felt like a suit. I kept it short. A company isn't saved, I told the room, when the powerful keep their titles. It's saved when the people who carried it finally get protected by it. Simone sat in the front row,
Her hair was still pulled back in that neat bun she always wore, but she'd traded the pastel pink dress for a soft pastel pink scarf over simple clothes. Lighter, somehow, less like armor, more like a woman who no longer needed a room's approval to know who she was. I took the small silver pin out of my jacket pocket, not Garrett's, which had been returned to the archive it never should have left, but the original one, the one that had belonged to my father, who'd worked as a subcontractor for this company decades ago and been underpaid for it long before I ever had the means to do anything about that.
I walked over to Vanessa Cole and placed it in her hand. "This was never meant for men who wanted to look important," I said. "It was meant for people who kept working when important men looked away." The applause wasn't the standing, roaring kind you'd get in a movie. It rose slowly, table by table, the way real respect usually does, earned rather than performed. That felt right to me. Some things shouldn't come easy, even when they're deserved. That evening, Simone and I sat on our back porch, the Texas heat finally breaking into something bearable, 2 glasses of iced tea sweating rings onto the wooden railing. "I don't want to love the version of you I can explain," she said, looking out at the yard instead of at me. "I want to know the one I ignored." "Then ask," I said, "and this time I'll answer." We didn't solve everything that night either. There was still the matter of the separate account she'd confessed to weeks earlier, still the matter of the boundary she'd let blur with Garrett long before that dinner, still the matter of her mother, who'd spent years telling Simone to marry visible success, and had gone quiet with shame once she learned what her son-in-law had actually been carrying. Marriages don't get repaired in a single scene on a porch. They get repaired in the 100 small scenes that come after it, the ones nobody writes a script for. But we made one agreement that night, plain and unglamorous. No more hidden accounts. No more hidden files. No more public masks worn to protect each other from truths we were both, in our own ways, afraid to hold. I think about that dinner sometimes, the wine glass raised toward me like a blessing for a beggar, the laughter that thought it understood exactly who I was. Garrett never once considered that the man he was mocking had spent a decade quietly making sure people like him couldn't do the kind of damage he'd already done. He looked at a navy suit and saw a man riding his wife's success. He never once thought to ask what I might be carrying instead. I've thought a lot since that night about how many marriages, how many families, how many friendships quietly erode, not because love ran out, but because truth did. How many people sit at dinner tables being underestimated by the very people who are supposed to know them best? A spouse who assumes silence means emptiness. A family that mistakes quiet for weakness. A room full of people who confuse volume with value. I carried a decade of protection for 700 strangers before I ever found the courage to hand my own wife the truth about the man she'd married. That's not something I'm proud of. It's something I'm honest about. My father used to tell me, back when he was still coming home every night smelling of engine grease and long hours, that a man doesn't need the room to clap for him. He needs his family to know he stood there. I believed that for most of my life, and there's still truth in it. But I've learned there's a difference between quiet dignity and quiet disappearance. My father meant the first. For a long time, without realizing it, I'd been practicing the second. Simone and I are still rebuilding, month by month, in ways too ordinary to make it into a highlight reel of this story. She asks more questions now. I answer them, even the uncomfortable ones. Some nights that's harder than any boardroom I've ever sat in. So here's what I'll leave you with, because I think this story was never really about a lapel pin, or an audit, or a boardroom. It was about the cost of staying invisible to protect the people we love, and the deeper cost of staying invisible for so long that they stop knowing how to see us at all. How many people in your own life are carrying something quietly right now? A debt paid, a burden shouldered, a truth withheld, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Comment one thing you carried quietly that someone finally needs to understand.